Welcome! This video is part 8 of a 9-part series and is intended for state, tribe, and territory disaster behavioral health coordinators and others involved with disaster planning, response, and recovery. The primary learning objectives of this video are to identify elements of legal and regulatory authority at the federal, state, territory, tribal, and local levels. Identify the elements of developing a Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU, and a Mutual Aid Agreement, or MAA. Finally, to understand issues of responders' liabilities, informed consent, and confidentiality. Let's begin by looking at what statutes address disaster response. Legal and regulatory authority at the federal level for the development of a comprehensive emergency management plan includes the Stafford Act, under which the Crisis Counseling Assistance and Training Program is listed, the Public Health Security and Bioterrorism Preparedness and Response Act, and the Homeland Security Act of 2002. Presidential directives also provide legal authority for emergency planning. Finally, there is the National Response Framework, including all of the emergency support functions, or ESFs, that fall under it. As a reminder, disaster behavioral health is under Emergency Support Function 8. Regarding legal and regulatory authority at the state level, all states have a statute that addresses who and what type of responder will respond after any type of disaster event. All 50 states and U.S. territories are members of the EMAC, which is the Emergency Management Assistance Compact. This arrangement gives states the ability to request assistance from other states following large-scale disasters and provides liability protection to states that come in to provide assistance. EMAC is a very important way of legally receiving assistance from another state. The governor's executive orders are similar to a presidential directive and are often given soon after disasters. Most of the time, in declaring a disaster, the governor will issue an executive order mandating that all executive-level state agencies work on that disaster. These executive orders also include the identification of state authorities for disaster behavioral health. States also have a comprehensive emergency management plan that mirrors the National Response Framework. As a reminder, disaster events are local and require a bottom-up response. The first response to these events relies on local emergency management ordinances for the local responder to respond. All local jurisdictions, just like the federal and state levels, are required to have a comprehensive emergency management plan. When you begin to develop your disaster behavioral health plan, the legal authority should be clearly defined. Ask the following questions. Under what authority are you developing your disaster behavioral health plan? Is it under a statute? Is it in a code? Is it under an executive order? Is it a policy within your agency or included in an MOU or an MAA? As you work within the comprehensive emergency plan, it is very important to find out who the lead agency is under the ESF 8 for health and medical needs. Consider, is your plan being written as a policy for your agency, as a standalone plan, or an annex to the state plan or the state ESF 8 plan? Additionally, the plan should be reviewed internally on a regular basis. Part of the reason we are looking at the authority and regulatory issue when it becomes part of a disaster response is liability. It must be spelled out clearly to everyone that risk is involved in any type of response. While you can't do away with risk, there are certain things that you can do to help minimize risk. First, clearly define the role of your responders. What are you asking them to do? Have clear information on understanding the workers' compensation laws for your state. Include descriptions of the responders' responsibilities and ensure that they know their lane. Training is a very important part of talking about liability and risk. Have open discussions during your training about the risk inherent in a response. Require all responders, including all disaster behavioral health responders, to complete the NIMS ICS training, a free online training from the Federal Emergency Management Agency. It helps responders understand the entire incident command system, and it should be mandated before anyone responds. Keep in mind that the Good Samaritan Law may apply. Contact your staff attorney, emergency management attorney, or attorney general to see if your state has a Good Samaritan Law and whether it would apply within your agency. Another way that liability can be mitigated is by working with your emergency management agency and having the disaster behavioral health response work under the state liability as an asset of the state response. It is also important to include concise language when writing policies and procedures for your responders. Your plan should state the requirements for individuals who want to participate in a disaster behavioral health response. Training, the completion of the required ICS courses, a medical screening, interviews with the team leaders and others. An orientation to a code of conduct or code of ethics is also important. If you don't have a code of conduct or a code of ethics, you should develop them. Under no circumstances should your disaster behavioral health team self-deploy. Most state statutes that talk about creation of state departments give the authority to develop policies to carry out official duties. One example of a disaster behavioral health policy would be the development of a disaster behavioral health committee that helps oversee training and exercises. The actual establishment of your disaster behavioral health teams could be a policy by your department. It's important in disaster behavioral health plans to begin to identify the other agencies you work with. What are their roles? How will you coordinate with those other agencies? Whether it's the Red Cross, the National Organization for Victim Assistance, or chaplains, how will you coordinate with them? Who is going to do what? Have these agreements and information spelled out before a disaster. To address the issue of authority, your plan could have some type of agreements with the other agencies that you are working with. As you begin to identify who else you will work with and identify how you will work together, you should formalize these relationships before a disaster occurs. This can be done through an MOU, which is a document describing bilateral or multilateral agreement between parties. An example of an MOU might be that your disaster behavioral health team and the Red Cross Disaster Mental Health Team support one another in providing mental health and substance use support in disaster shelters. There are also MAAs. An example of an MAA might be that a district mental health team would provide assistance to another district. As we look at the legal, regulatory, or policy authorities, the following issues need to be clearly addressed in your disaster behavioral health plan: liability, confidentiality, how you will implement the MOUs, how you will implement the MAAs, and confirmation that your plan complies with the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, or HIPAA. It should also include the process for credentialing and deal with reimbursement issues. The final step for when you start developing your plan would be to contact your Homeland Security and Emergency Management partners and get copies of all the relevant laws. Contact your legal staff and legal staff at Emergency Management to see how you can get disaster behavioral health implemented into state statute or to work through existing policy development. You need to find out who your ESF 8 lead is, and finally survey community agencies that you are currently working with to see if there is any need to formalize that relationship. This concludes the legal and regulatory guidance video within the Promising Practices series. Thanks for tuning in. The other videos in this series will explore each of the standards that can enhance your state disaster behavioral health plan. To view an expanded version of this video, go to www.samhsa.gov/dtac/webinars-podcasts and scroll down to the Promising Practices in Disaster Behavioral Health Planning series. Established by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA, the Disaster Technical Assistance Center, DTAC, supports SAMHSA's efforts to prepare states, territories, and tribes to deliver an effective mental health and substance use-related response to disasters. For training and technical assistance inquiries, you can call SAMHSA DTAC toll-free at 1-800-308-3515 or email dtac@samhsa.hhs.gov. Or you can visit www.samhsa.gov/dtac. Before we conclude, we'd like to give a special thanks to Andrew Klatt, who contributed the original content of this video.